Time for questions and reflections from day 8. We'll start with the Renaissance. And the question is, what happens in the dream Sophie has during her nap after returning home, and what does she wake up with? And what is the significance of having it in her possession upon waking? Now, the second part is obviously requires a little bit more interpretation, but let's start with the first. What happens is pretty straightforward. Look on page 1. It goes from 190 to 191, it looks like. Sophie, dreamed she was standing in a large garden that sloped down to a red boathouse. On the dock behind it sat a young, fair-haired girl gazing out over the water. Sophie walked down and sat beside her, but the girl seemed not to notice. Keep this scene in mind. You'll see it again. Let's see. Sophie introduced herself. "I'm Sophie," she said, but the other girl could apparently neither see nor hear her. Suddenly, Sophie heard a voice calling, "Hilda!" At once, the girl jumped up from where she was sitting and ran as fast as she could up to the house. She couldn't have been deaf or blind after all. A middle-aged man came striding from the house toward her. He was wearing a khaki uniform and a blue beret. The girl threw her arms around his neck, and he swung her around a few times. Sophie noticed a little gold crucifix on a chain lying on the dock where the girl had been sitting. She picked it up and held it in her hand. Then she woke up. Sophie looked at the clock. She had been asleep for 2 hours. She sat up in bed thinking about the strange dream, and it was so real that she felt as if she had actually lived the experience. Interesting choice of words, right? She was equally sure that the house and the dock really existed somewhere. Surely it resembled the picture she had seen hanging in the Major's cabin. Go back there. What was that again? You had the man Barclay, which I continue to pronounce occasionally Berkeley just for the spelling purposes, and then the other picture, Bjerkeli, or however that should be pronounced, that being the name of the house and everything that's in there. So there's that parallel between those two pictures again. And this was surely, in her dream, the house that was in that picture. Anyway, there was no doubt at all that the girl in her dream was Hilda Müller-Nag. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And that the man was her father, home from Lebanon. The demon, as you were, of this whole story, it would seem. In her dream, he had looked a lot like Alberto Knox. Weird. As Sophie stood up and began to tidy her bed, she found a gold crucifix on a chain under her pillow. And there it is. And of course, on the crucifix, HMK for Hilda Müller-Nag is engraved in it. Now, notice she doesn't say that it looked and was Alberto Knox. It's not like he looked a lot like Alberto Knox. It's not the same thing like saying he looked like Alberto Knox, right? A lot like implies here that they're clearly different people, but just looked a lot like him. Interesting. So that's what happens during the dream. And then she wakes up, obviously, with the crucifix. But what is the significance of having it in her possession upon waking? What do you think? What is the significance? Now, I think that as far as I can say anything about what's happening so far in the story, what can we take away from this if we don't know what's going to happen later on in the book, in other words? Well, we have seen this parallel between Alberto Knox plus Sophie and the father of Hilda and Hilda. So we definitely get that from the dream, but the crucifix itself is another object. Obviously, she throws it up on the shelf along with the other things where this has happened. It represents, first of all, yet another thing, another physical thing, it would seem, that has somehow, magically, it would seem, followed her from the dream into reality. Extremely bizarre, obviously. We don't expect this to happen. But there's something further than that even, because remember, there was the scarf, and there was the sense that it was Hilda's scarf, but we couldn't be sure. It could have been any old scarf. But Sophie fell asleep, had a dream about holding this crucifix, and woke up with it, and right there in bed with her. There's no, we've clearly transgressed across any line that made it possible that this was a gag up to this point. Like the red scarf thing, maybe Hilda did or didn't have a red scarf. Maybe that's part of a make-believe storyline, whatever. This is real for her, and there she is with it. And nobody could have known, if this were a gag, when she would need to have it with her, because how could you predict what she was going to dream? And how could you, even if you, could somehow see into her dreams, how could you reproduce the crucifix or cross on the spot? There is something else. There's something else. It is not a mere gag that's going on. There's one other quick reference, though, that I think also points out something important. It says on 194, Sophie says, it's said that Hilda has lost her crucifix. She's talking about the postcard. So I read, says the philosopher, and I found it, the same one, under my pillow at home. Can you understand how it got there? Alberto looked gravely into her eyes. It may seem alluring, but it's just a cheap trick that costs him no effort whatsoever. Let us rather concentrate on the big white rabbit that is pulled out of the universe's top hat. What does he mean? I said it's not a gag. He's saying it is something like a cheap trick, though. And who is he talking about? Is he talking about Hilda's father? That is who they seem to be in contention with up to this point. Maybe. It costs him no effort whatsoever. So, if that's true, and it's hard to take Alberto too seriously here because we don't really know what he's talking about. We don't even know for sure he's referring to Hilda's father. But if he is, what does he mean it costs him no effort? We just saw that this is insane. If you could make things come out of your dreams into the physical reality that you and I live in, if that's what truly just happened, then how could it not cost some effort? What sort of science would be behind this? Or if you're a sorcerer or something, maybe? This is seeming to take a radical turn here. Not only is this thing so wildly impossible seeming, but this wild, impossible thing is apparently doable by Hilda's father. All those references before to the sort of like godliness, godly qualities of Hilda's father, those parallels should not be ignored. There's this constant parallel of the relationship to philosophers and theologians, to a Christian God and the workings of God, and then this happening within Sophie's world and Hilda's father. Is Hilda's father God? Maybe that's not quite the right question, but maybe it's getting us a little bit closer there. And that is all I'm at liberty to say at the moment. What is at least one difference between the theism of medieval scholasticism and the growing pantheism of the Renaissance? Theism is just sort of a category in which we might put religions or mythologies, where it has to do with a god or even gods. So you could have polytheism again, where you have multiple gods, or monotheism, which is about one god, if you recall that. So theism is just about god or gods as part of a school of philosophy or religion. But then pantheism, if you remember, pan here meaning to be wide-sweeping, and to be, as it were, part of or inherent to or immanent in everything, then pantheism is again that idea that, well, if God really is whatever God that is, any divine being, whatever works best for you, is truly infinite, then would it not make sense that among all the other instantiations of that God, that is, all the other ways that God could show up in the world, that our universe is one of them? And so that means that everything is maybe a part of God, as opposed to just a product of God, is the idea. That is, if we take that line of thinking seriously. Now, for a specific reference, let's go to page 201. And it says near the bottom of the page, the last paragraph anyway, but enough about the boldness of the Renaissance man. It was also significant that the Renaissance brought with it a new view of nature. The fact that man felt at home in the world and did not consider life solely as a preparation for the hereafter, the afterlife, created a whole new approach to the physical world. Nature was now regarded as a positive thing. Many held the view that God was also present in his creation. If he is indeed infinite, he must be present in everything, and this idea is called pantheism. The medieval philosophers had insisted that there is an insurmountable barrier between God and the creation. It could now be said that nature is divine, and even that it is God's blossoming. So again, this distinction between creation as part of God, as being of God, versus being a product of God. And so what does that do to the conception of nature or our world or universe? Well, I mean, if we're thinking from a Neoplatonic model where you've got, the light that is God, and as you get farther from God, it's darker, and you get, lesser forms and kind of worser incarnations of forms and so forth. And then you've got even like evil and grotesque demon type stuff towards the bottom. Of course, these are all interpretations of Plotinus' work, not Plotinus' work itself. But in that conception, God is up here, and God is a unique and distinct individual, and everything else is separate in some sense from him. Even though some of it is, partaking more in his divine light than others, he's still distinct. Pantheism changes this monstrously in a way. That would mean that if everything is part of God and God is the light, there really is no dark. That means that evil and all other things too are somehow part of that conception of God being in and of everything, or everything being some part of God. It's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine babies being murdered, or animals, or forests of other creatures being abused or threatened or destroyed, or that these are somehow part of God's divine being. That's really hard to conceptualize, and yet at the same time, maybe it's just due to the limits of our understanding or imagination that we would interpret it otherwise. So pantheism is a very interesting notion. It seems to follow a line of reason that makes sense. On the other hand, it makes you wonder about the nature of evil. Maybe going back to Augustine and reviewing some of that stuff would be a good move from here. All right, what possible reason does Alberto give Sophie for twice calling her Hilda? What do you think of his explanation? And he only really tries to justify himself once, but he does obviously call her Hilda twice. And we'll want to look on 214. And then the second, so that's 214 has the both references. So if we look towards the top of the page, it says, "We shall have to keep that for another day, my dear Hilda." "What did you say?" Sophie shot up from the chair she had been sitting in. "You called me Hilda." "That was a serious slip of the tongue." "But a slip of the tongue is never wholly accidental." "You may be right. You'll notice that Hilda's father has begun to put words in our mouths. I think he is exploiting the fact that we are getting wary and are not defending ourselves very well." "You said once that you are not Hilda's father. Is that really true?" Alberto nodded. "But am I Hilda?" "I am tired now, Sophie. You have to understand that. We've been sitting here for over 2 hours, and I have been doing most of the talking. Don't you have to go home to eat?" Kind of brushes her off. All right. Is this Alberto speaking right now in this brushing off? Or are these words being put in mouths? Now, both slip of the tongue and putting words in someone's mouth are figurative statements. To have a slip of the tongue doesn't mean you literally trip on your tongue. It means you accidentally say something you didn't mean. Or maybe at some level you really think that, but you didn't mean for it to come out that way. That is an obvious figurative statement here. But this idea of putting words in our mouths, when you put words in somebody's mouth, it's figurative. What you're doing is you are trying to jump to a conclusion that they are not trying to necessarily make. And so we use that statement, stop putting words in my mouth. That's not what I'm saying. That's not what I actually mean. But here, we have to question, does Alberto mean something much more literal than this? There is this theme in parts of the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament, where God literally has a prophet speak his words through the prophet, and the words of God through the prophet. And so you could think of it as a literal putting of words in one's mouth. Is that what's going on here? Is this analogy between God and Hilda's father being drawn yet again? Shortly after that, also in 2:14 at the bottom, she gave Alberto an impulsive hug. She's saying goodbye. Impulsive, interesting word. An impulsive hug. You're the best and kindest philosophy teacher I've ever had, she said. With that, she opened the door to the staircase. As the door closed, Alberto said, it won't be long before we meet again, Hilda. Sophie was left with those words. Another slip of the tongue, the villain. Sophie had a strong desire to turn around and hammer on the door, but something held her back. An impulsive hug. Being held back from knocking on the door. These are, again, very interesting words to be using in this context where words are being put in our mouths and our actions seem to be induced by somebody else. Start following that train of thought and guess ahead of time, if you can, what's going on. Let's move on to the Baroque. How does Alberto react to the new postcards Sophie receives, as well as the new manner in which they are received? We can look on page 224 for that reference. The bottom of the page. Let's see. And you really found 10 crowns on the same spot where he planted the card, Hilda's father. Exactly, says Sophie. He gets ruder all the time, but maybe it's just as well. Why? It'll make it easier to unmask him. But this trick was pompous and tasteless. It almost stinks of cheap perfume. Perfume? It tries to be elegant, but is really a sham. Can't you see how he has the effrontery to compare his own shabby surveillance of us with God's providence? He held up the card, then he tore it to pieces. So as not to make his mood worse, she refrained from mentioning the card that fell out of her exercise book at school. This is pretty fun. Of course, we already had that analogy between Hilda's father and God. And now, what is Alberto doing? If Alberto clearly is exercising a lot of free will here in saying, if we can talk about Hilda's father as some sort of God in some sense, and if he is a God, he's a shabby one. He's something of a sham. He's full of tricks, not miracles. So, and in spite of these like crazy things that are being done, he tears up the postcard, right? Now imagine going into a church or something and taking, some text, whether it's the Bible itself or one of the choir books or anything in there, maybe even like one of the sign-in sheets or something, tearing it up right there in the church. How blasphemous seeming wouldn't that seem? Doesn't that just seem like an effrontery itself to what is supposed to be of sacred value to everybody in this place? And so if Hilda's father is a god, he certainly doesn't have that much control over the situation. And furthermore, he stinks of cheap perfume. It's clearly all just sort of a cover-up for something, not something inherently miraculous. What two diametrically opposed viewpoints were tackled during the Baroque period of philosophy? Which, if either, do you think is prominent in mainstream thinking today? Hopefully, you remember also from the in-depth view, we talked about idealism and materialism, and that's what we're looking at here again. Take a look at page 230. That too is characterized by powerful struggles between diametrically opposed modes of thought. As I have already mentioned, some philosophers believed that what exists is at bottom spiritual in nature. This standpoint is called idealism. Quick asterisk here. the idealism here doesn't necessarily, we don't necessarily mean spiritual here as in religious. Spiritual here would mean of mind, or you could say it could be mental. And there are multiple forms of idealism. There's not just one monolithic version of this. So keep that in mind. The opposite viewpoint is called materialism. By this is meant a philosophy which holds that all real things derive from concrete material substances. We talked about, again, it's really in part the difference between physical and non-physical stuff. There's actually in materialism, though, what we can call a branch of specifically physicalism, which is saying that material, not in the sense of just concrete things, but of physical things themselves, that's what everything else is reducible down to or based on. So there's more than one way to describe materialism, as well as idealism. Jump down a bit. Both idealism and materialism are themes you will find all through the history of philosophy, but seldom have both views been so clearly present at the same time as in the Baroque. Materialism was constantly nourished by the new sciences. Newton showed that the same laws of motion applied to the whole universe, and that all changes in the natural world, both on Earth and in space, were explained by principles of universal gravitation and the motion of bodies. And again, we went into in the in-depth look, we went into detail around this. And if you remember that painting, The Raising of the Cross, Rubens is depicting this event in both its idealistic, that is very spiritual, very aesthetically pleasing, and its more material forms, the muscle, the blood that is dripping down the hands of Christ from the nails, and the trees, and it's all twistedness and the shadow and everything. So you've got sort of both of those aesthetic pieces in there in such a way that you can almost feel the tension between the idealism and the materialism in these things. And we talked at length too on Kepler and how idealism and materialism can coexist and in fact work towards one explanation of things for the same person. So they're definitely not two diametrically opposed things with a separation in between them, but maybe we could say instead two things in opposition at their extreme ends, and the middle is perhaps somewhere where most people lie. I also mentioned again that there is a third option. The essence of it is that our world seems impossible of reducing in either direction to the ideal spiritual / mental, solipsistic, as we'll see later on what that means in the case of Berkeley, nor does it seem to be entirely reducible to sheer physical things or material things. But there's perhaps not even a happy medium, but a third way to describe the things in our world. With that, I hope you got what you're looking for, and I'll see you again next week.